opinion, I believe that Zelensky and the Europeans can now sit down with Putin and they can work this out. I'm not going to cut a deal and then try and force it down the throats of the Ukrainians and the Europeans.
So John Mearsheimer recently revealed the cold, hard truth.
All right. Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. It is Ryan and I.
Yesterday's meeting. There's just no question about that. And that's really all he had to do was come and look diplomatic, look smart, look respectful of President Trump. And it would do a great deal to put an end to his isolation in the West and give him real legitimacy. Mm-hmm. And he came in, and as I think almost everybody expected, he did the job. And he was very effective in that way. And then there's the whole question of the ceasefire, which you raise. Just for the audience's purposes, or for clarification for the audience, it's important to understand that there's a difference between a peace agreement and a ceasefire. And really what the Russians want is not a ceasefire because they're winning on the battlefield. What they want is a peace agreement. And what the West wants and the Ukrainians want is a ceasefire. And Trump tried to convince Putin that what we need here is a ceasefire.
And Trump has no leverage to hold over Putin to say that what we need here is a ceasefire. Putin will fully understand immediately when Trump says this type of thing, or however he, try to convey that message, that a ceasefire only gives time for America or other NATO countries to fortify or try to replenish Ukraine, whatever's left of the Ukrainian fighters. I don't know, maybe involve us in their war. I don't know. As far as on the ground, this is our war. I always say this is America's war, just proxy through Ukraine. And that's why there is no such thing as peace coming. And I had to learn that. I used to be one of those MAGA people who actually thought that Trump was going to bring peace in Ukraine. And I had to wake up about that. Now, John Mearsheimer is breaking it down like John Mearsheimer always does. And so we're going to listen to a little bit more of what John had to say about the meeting. And then I'll, of course, give my perspective on, what happened there at the meeting. So without any further ado, please, guys, if you do like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and a subscribe button and a notification bell. Thank you to every eye that lands on these videos.
And what resulted is that Putin said there will be no ceasefire. We have to have a peace agreement. And in fact, Trump has now backed off from demanding a ceasefire. And he said to someone after the meeting that the best solution to this problem is to go directly to a peace agreement. In other words, putting the ceasefire that the Ukrainians and the Europeans and many people in the United States want aside. He's saying that's a non-starter after having talked to Putin. So I think in terms of the clip that you just showed, that's the most important substantive point.
And can you unpack for people why Ukraine would be reluctant to reach a peace agreement versus an immediate ceasefire? Like what is the advantage of one over the other to Ukraine?
Well, the advantages of a ceasefire are mainly that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and the West cannot do much to help it at this point in time. So if you can create a ceasefire, put an end to the fighting on the battlefield, that Ukrainians a respite, number one. And number two, it allows them to get more arms from the West to build up their forces and then put up a better fight against the Russians moving forward once the fighting restarts. In other words, once the ceasefire ends. But the Russians are not Dumkovs, and they understand if they're winning, it would be nuts, to put it bluntly, for them to stop the war when they're winning, allow the Ukrainians to recover, and then fight more effectively at some point down the road. So the Russians have no interest in a ceasefire. Ukraine and the West really like the idea. What the Russians want is they want a peace agreement. they want to settle this one, but they want to settle it on their terms. It's very important to understand this. The Russians view Ukraine joining NATO as an existential threat. This war for them is existential. And they have a set of demands that they will not compromise on. And there are three principal demands. One is that Ukraine and the West recognize that Russia has annexed those 4 oblasts that they now partially occupy, 4 oblasts in Ukraine, plus Crimea. That's demand number one. Demand number two is that Ukraine be a neutral state. That means it can't be in NATO, and there can't be Western security guarantees, especially a security guarantee from the United States. Ukraine, from the Russian perspective, has to be neutral. Third demand is that Ukraine has to disarm, not completely, but disarm to the point where it has no offensive military capability, i.e. it can't threaten Russia. Now, these are three harsh demands from the Ukrainian point of view and from the West point of view. These are unacceptable demands to the Ukrainians and to most people in the West. And this is why you can't get a peace agreement. So what we have here is the Russians want a peace agreement. The Ukrainians and the West have no interest in a peace agreement. The West and the Ukrainians want a ceasefire, and the Russians have no interest in a ceasefire.
But what we have here is the reality that the West and the Ukrainians clearly don't hold the cards, because they have to still, they don't hold the cards. I mean, Trump said that to Zelensky the last time Zelensky was there. And Zelensky's actually at the White House now, and my next video I'll cover that. But he did say that, after all of the show that he put on, and believe me, while I saw a bunch of Americans being excited, like, oh my gosh, Trump is back at the White House, he's taking control. I saw it for the exact show that what he did to Zelensky. No matter how you feel about Zelensky as a leader, I'm not a Zelensky fan in any fashion, but Trump, that behavior was so childish to me, because it's like, you don't do that with leaders from other countries. Okay, so stop it. But when he did say to him, you don't hold the cards, he was right. He was absolutely right about that. That is simply true. In order to keep on going, so if you can't give, and they're not going to, the logical thing would be to say, hey, you know what? Fine. Just give Russia what they want. It's not going to happen. Clearly, it's not going to happen. So what happens? They're going to make irrational decisions. That's what I see coming from this. I see irrational decisions getting ready to come out of this whole situation. Because the thing is, okay, the people above Trump, and yes, I know the country I live in, he's supposed to be the president, commander in chief, but sorry, the reality is there's people who have. He answers to people, donors. I mean, come on, guys. Like, this is 2025. So the people above Trump, their interest in Ukraine is almost religious to them. And I don't say this in a overstated tone, because when this particular small military operation started in 2022. And then I was watching the Biden administration and the way they could not stop, the way they could not stop. From even first the excitement of we're taking on Russia, which I didn't find any excitement in that. But then even when they should have pulled out, they were still going full steam ahead, sending more military weapons, sending more help, sending this, sending that. To the point there was Americans on the ground, everything. I was just watching all this irrational decision making, and I said, okay, this is something religious for them almost. They cannot let it go. They won't let it go. They won't. And so that was their thing, and they danced for it, right? But with the Republicans, of course, they're not going to hoot and holler for Ukraine, but they're still with the plan. The only reason we don't hear loads and loads of money and weapons being sent over to Ukraine over and over and over again is because, well, I don't think that we can. I mean, because we're already fronting Israel's genocide in Gaza. Also, anything else that, we're also behind Israel with their, with wanting to disarm the resistance in Lebanon. That's going to cost a lot of money to get involved with that. We're dealing with al-Julani in Syria, and what we do over there, helping them out with the Al Qaeda forces. These are things that in my mind, it's not in my mind. We do fund these kind of things because now we see that troops are leaving Syria. So it's just because, well, when you put Al Qaeda on the top, so you don't really need American troops necessarily because the puppet you placed in works for you. Now, so America's really deeply, heavily involved. Because Israel takes a lot of work. It does. So they can't send but so much at this point. We've also depleted our stockpile. And then with Israel, there's that, right? That's the only reason why you don't see this boatload of constant giving and giving and giving. But they're not going to stop. They're not going. I knew. Now, I will say, when I still thought I was going to vote for Trump, I did think that he would come in and stop the war. But then part of me was like, even then I was like, I just can't see how he does it because we're going to be just in a hotter war. So I said, we're going to eventually go into like a hot war with Russia. But now with Iran and everything else on the table, it's almost like we're taking on all three because in China's, so China's there. And China's still China is a goal. They want to be done with all this so they can get to China. But it's almost like you would think they would maybe go to China while dealing with Russia and Iran. I'm not really sure how they'll be able to pull that off. I want to be careful because I don't want to somehow accidentally predict, look like I'm cheering on for World War III. I'm not. God, can some miracle happen so that we don't have to see a lot of what would come with that. But they're not going to stop. There's no reverse gear for them. They might slow down, but there's no reverse gear. So that peace talk that Putin wants, he's not going to get it. He should have it, but he's not going to get it. And where does that leave everybody else?